Welcome to Western Theological Seminary. Thank you for coming out today. Today, I'm Ben Connor. Because I don't know everyone here. I'm Ben Connor. I'm a professor here, and I created and run the Graduate Certificate in Disability Ministry. Aside from that, we're trying to do all kinds of other things to make the campus more accessible, to change the culture on the campus. And part of that involved bringing in Lennard J to help us think through issues of ableism and disability as an aspect of diversity and inclusion and all these sorts of things. So this morning, the faculty and staff of the seminary have been doing some workshops with Dr. Davis. And this afternoon, we've invited you to come join us to hear about disability as an aspect of diversity. So I was going to say all the things that are on the slide. I still will. So Lennard J. Davis is a distinguished professor, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, University of Illinois at Chicago, professor, College of Applied Sciences, Health Sciences, and professor of College of Medicine. His recent book, Enabling Acts, The Hidden Story of How the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest U.S. minority its rights, was chosen as an outstanding book by the Association of University Presses. His previous books, Enforcing Normalcy, Disability, Deafness, and the Body, and Disability Studies Reader, which he edited, which has 5 editions, are mainstays in disability studies and works I've drawn upon and work I do with theology and disability as well. And I learned last night at dinner that one of his students was Barack Obama. I didn't know that previously, so that was fun. Like I said, he's been leading our faculty in conversation. We've enjoyed being with him, and we're glad to share him with you as well. And also wanted to promote this as well. What I've been reading from his work, you have to have a little background to understand, to know what the terms are, or else a sort of dictionary of disability studies terms. But this is a very accessible book that's just come out, beginning with disability, a primer. He's the editor and also contributor to this very accessible volume. So if you're interested in thinking more about issues of disability, this is a great place to start. So without any further introduction, please welcome with me Dr. Lennard Davis.
I think I met a lot of you earlier. Some of what I was going to say now might be a little bit of a repetition, but repetition is the mother of learning, or something like that. Is this working better? What's that? Yeah, I can turn it on. I think you can all hear me, but how's that? Is that better? Is that better? Yes. Okay. I want to thank Ben for inviting me, along with all of the people who are involved in this process, and commend him for the work he's doing here in bringing disability to your institution. Or I won't say, okay. If the president claps, you must join. But everything that I've seen has been impressive, and the involvement of faculty this morning has been very heartening. So good, that's good news. So the talk I'm going to give today is about diversity and disability, and I was thinking, I have a prepared talk which I'll dip into from time to time. I'm using prepared talks less and speaking more freely. But I'm kind of between the positions that I should be for this talk, which is that on the one hand, I would say that I want disability to be part of diversity. And we talked about this earlier when people talk about race, class, gender, LGBTQ, they often fail to include ability or disability. And there are complex reasons for that. On the other hand, I also want to question the concept of diversity in and of itself as a, just this, do we really know what it is, and is it a good? So I'm kind of going to be between those two positions in this talk, which might seem confusing. So if it's confusing, let me know. The other thing is that I kind of based this talk around the work that I've done on normality, which I'm going to assume you're not familiar with. But I wrote a book called Enforcing Normalcy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so the talk is kind of a way to think around the issues of normality, difference, diversity, disability. And I started out with the idea that, in some sense, the culture that we're living in now, or the moment that we're living in now, is kind of an identity culture eschaton, in the sense that people are saying, like, are we beyond identity? I mean, this kind of was more happening when Barack Obama was elected, and less, in some sense, happening now with Black Lives Matter and other groups like that. But there's a question about, where are we in the question about identity? And one thing is to think about, does this have anything to do with the way that the concept of normalcy has worked over time? And one of the things I argue in my book is that the idea of normalcy or normality is very influential, and has been very influential in the past, in terms of the way we think about race, and in terms of the way we think about disability and identity. And I'll just talk a little bit more about that. So the question that I'm also thinking about is, if normalcy is having less sway in terms of talking about identity, then is something replacing it? And is that something that's replacing it diversity, and what does that mean? So in other words, to put it simply, is diversity doing the work of normality, or is diversity the new normal? I wrote a book called The End of Normal, so and this is partly from that. So in the past, let me see where we're going on the slides. Okay, so in the past, and this is kind of an explanation of where the word normal comes from and where the concept comes from. In the past, there was, many cultures were monocultural, and they could define themselves by a norm and a standard. And so the word normal enters the English language and the European languages around the middle of the 19th century. And one of the questions is like, well, so how did that happen? And if you think about it, the power of the word normal and the power it has to affect us and make us want to be normal. This is a photograph of a man named Quetelet in France, who came up with the concept of, in French, l'homme moyen, the average man, the average person. And what he did was literally measure the bodies of people. He was a statistician, and the word statistics, which we're all familiar with, comes from the idea of numbers about the state. So it's statistics. So people began to, at the end of the 18th century, to measure what was the population of towns, what was the amount of water that was consumed, what was the square footage of housing. It was like measures of how much money was being brought in, so it was called statistics. And Quetelet said, hey, why can't we do this with human beings? Why can't we measure human beings and come up with the average man? He didn't use the word normal because it wasn't available at the time. And so literally he went around measuring all these Frenchmen and came up with what like the standard measurement of the Frenchman was. Adolphe Quetelet. So then in England there was a guy named Sir Francis Galton. He was Darwin's cousin, and he was the one who said, well, look, if you can and he was a statistician also. And he was the one who said, look, if you can measure people, then don't we want to like work on that and get better people? The 19th century was this era of breeding of animals and breeding of plants, and the idea was like, why not breed a better human? So he coined the term eugenics, which means good genes, although they didn't know what genes were, but it was like good genetic material. And he advocated eugenics. In addition to that, he came up with this curve, which we now know we call it the bell curve, but it was also back then called the normal curve. And the reason it was called the normal curve was the word normal existed in English, but it meant a carpenter's square. That looks like that. And if you look at in that graph, you'll see the carpenter's square. So the idea was with the bell curve, Galton noticed that if you measured any phenomenon, it would always eventually fall into a bell curve. In fact, he made a machine that he called the Quinquix. And you can go, if you happen to go to London, and if you're crazy, or I'm not going to use the word crazy, if you're fascinated by Galton or by eugenics, you can go to his lab, which is at the University of London, and you can see the Quinquix. And the Quinquix is like a kind of device with nails and ball bearings. And if you drop the ball bearings in, they'll always form a bell curve. So he came up with the idea of the bell curve, and he came up with the idea, they called it the normal curve. So the word normal comes from this idea of everything that's underneath the carpenter's square. The other thing he did was that but there's a problem, right? Because if you look at and he would measure, Galton was a great measurer. He went around and he measured the hand strength. He was involved initially in the idea of measuring intelligence. He measured. He made a map of the most, where you would find the prettiest women in the UK. He went to each city and he would walk down the street and he had like a little thing in his pocket, which he used a little pin and a piece of paper, and it was shaped like a cross. And he had like at the top, beautiful, ugly, I forget what the other two sides were, and he would put pinpricks in. And of course, it turned out that the most beautiful women in England were in London, which is the problem with eugenics. Because it's always going to be selected toward the traits that you think are the best traits based on who you are. So we'll come to that in a minute. But so Galton had a problem, though, because if you measure things like height and weight and intelligence, what's the problem with this curve if you're a eugenicist? That's the question that makes you nervous to answer. So, so the problem is that the extremes, like if what's underneath the curve is normal, the extremes are going to be abnormal. So if you're a eugenicist, low intelligence and high intelligence are both abnormal. And if you're a eugenicist, shortness and tallness are both abnormal. So in other words, the problem for eugenicists is that the bell curve shows you mediocrity. Or you're in the middle. So what he did was he flipped it around. He flipped the right side around and to form an ogive, right? An O-G-I-V-E. So what he did was essentially, he made a value judgment that one side of the bell curve was good and the other side was bad. So height would be in the right, intelligence would be on the right, whatever you were going to be breeding for was going to be on the right. So, and the other thing he invented were quartiles and quintiles. So divide it up, and if quartiles and quintiles sound familiar to you, they are because they're used in the SATs and the ACTs and intelligence tests. That's where it all comes from. The idea of testing your intelligence is a completely eugenic process, even though they still require it for you to get into college. So, so then what happened was the problem, as I said, is that as soon as you flip the right side, then you're going to start selecting for traits that you think are important. And it turned out that, linked to evolution was the idea of progress, but also de-evolution. So you worried about the fact that your country, in this case England, was inhabited more and more by immigrants. And we still see that problem today, that issue as a problem. So there was an idea of there were fitter families and unfit families. And in this picture, obviously the fitter family from the eugenic perspective was the one on the left, and the unfit family was the immigrant family from Italy, for example, or from the Middle East, or Jews or Italians, Eastern Europeans, Africans, anybody who didn't fit into the British standard of what they imagined was what you wanted to breed for. So there's this intimate connection, if you think about the word normal, with I guess you would say, supremacist ideas about how the human body should look, who are the right people, what is the right kind of intelligence, and there were fitter families. There was an attempt to breed for fitter families. So immigrants, indigenous people, people of color, and foreigners were always going to be abnormal, and were proven to be so based on these biometric tests and creative solutions to anomalous data. So, for example, if you've ever read the book *The Mismeasure of Man*, Robert, what is it? Remind me his name. Anyway, Robert J. Gould, is that his name? Anyway, it's a book where, as part of the eugenics project, they measured cranial size. And the argument would be that white European men they were the smartest, they had the biggest brains. Well, it would turn out that the numbers didn't quite crunch, and that that people from sub-Saharan Africa sometimes had bigger brains, sometimes women had bigger brains than men. So they just fudged the numbers, because they wanted it to come out the way they wanted it to come out. So creative solutions to anomalous data. So the word normal, you have to understand it as a kind of malevolent word, with deep roots in this kind of discrimination and this kind of viewing of the human body and the mind. Now, if you think about diverse versus normal, so if you think about diverse is a replacement in some sense for the idea of normal. We don't, like in other words, you could have said in the past that it was the normal state was to be white, to be a European male, and the abnormal state was to be a person of color or an immigrant. You can't say that now. I think we've made it clear in our culture and time that there are no normal races, there are no normal ethnicities, that they're all part of a nation of diversity. And I'm saying that the word diverse has replaced the word normal in our culture for this kind of conversation about identity. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think there are good things. The idea of diversity has many things to recommend it over the concept of normal. On the surface, we're better off abandoning some universal standard for bodies and for cultures and acknowledging that there isn't one regnant or ideal body or culture, that they all are in play concerning each other and should be equally valued. Diversity is, in fact, a much more democratic concept than normality, since diversity applies to the broad range of the population rather than normality, which, of course, eschews the normal. And here are some images that celebrate diversity. I'm going to describe, I haven't been doing this, I'm going to describe the images because in case anyone has limited sight. One is a circle that says celebrate diversity. One is a square that shows different color hands kind of revolving around each other. One is a circle but with stripes in different colors, but it's supposed to represent and then there are people standing around the circle. It says celebrate diversity. And then there is a series of different color skin, hands with different color skin, with fists grabbing the wrists of forming a kind of pentagon. By the way, it's a good exercise to try to do this for your descriptive skills, and it also has the side benefit of helping people who can't see. And the thing about diversity is it's always something we celebrate. Right. So I want to come back to that, but so the other thing is that I wanted to just present here, since we're talking about disability studies, is a model of the different models of, this is not quite working the way I wanted it to, but there are different models of the way people have thought about disability in the past and now. And the first model is the charity model, which I went over this morning, but I just give a visual on it, which is the question of how do we think about disability in the charity religious model? So the disability comes either from God or from a sin committed in the past. It creates the disability, and the remedy is prayer and alms. The medical model is that where the disability comes from is either genetics, disease, or trauma, which creates the disability, and then the solution to it is treatment or cure. And then there's the social model, which argues that it's the political, social, and cultural practices that create disability, and the remedy is accommodation on the one hand and analysis on the other. So in the social model, the argument is that there's a distinction between disability and impairment. So an impairment is a physical or mental limitation, a lack or an inability. And then the disability is not that, but it's the effect of discrimination or a lack of accommodation against people with impairments. So a classic example is the wheelchair analogy. You know, a person using a wheelchair is disabled when confronting steps, but not disabled in a ramped and elevatored environment. So it's but the question is that's a little more complicated is with a person with a psychiatric disorder is disabled when confronting what? Obviously discrimination, but you know, it's a harder one to analyze because what's the cure? Rather than curing the illness itself, what's the cure in the social sense? So the solution to the wheelchair problem is to provide ramps. And the solution to the psychiatric problem is to provide what, which we could talk about. Then also in disability studies, a lot of disability studies started out with people discussing physical disabilities. And more recently, people have been discussing psychiatric impairments. So physical impairments are based on a medical diagnosis. Psychiatric impairments are based on psychiatric diagnoses. And so the question is, are psychiatric diagnoses real or socially constructed or both? And the reason I say that, I'm not saying that to denigrate psychiatric disabilities, but I'm saying that when it comes to understanding, for example, that the book that people use for psychiatric diagnoses is the DSM. And the DSM is a diagnostic and statistical manual. It's used by practitioners to assign diagnoses. It comes out every 5 to 10 years, and every time it comes out, there are 30% more illnesses than there were before. So it makes you say, like, well, so are we just getting more and more psychiatrically ill, or is there more and more refinement, or is it that new things are being created that weren't around before? But the point is, and I'm not going to talk about it right now, but that there's a lot of issues around the notion that psychiatric impairment is purely a description of what is rather than what groups of people think at a given time. The example I think you could all immediately relate to is that in the DSM-2, homosexuality was a psychiatric disorder. In DSM-3, it wasn't. And that DSM-3 came after Stonewall and the political movement around being gay and lesbian and trans. So how could it change if it was not, in some sense, socially influenced, right? And even physical impairments, because we talked this morning a little bit about the problems of the social model. And one of the problems is that it uses impairment as a kind of unquestioning thing. You know, it's like you can't walk, you don't have a leg, that's like clear. But when you go to talk about psychiatric impairments, it's a little less clear because is it an impairment, or even in the physical impairment, is it only medically determined? You know, there's a great book by Nora Gross called Everybody Here Spoke Sign Language. And it's about Martha's Vineyard in the 19th century. And, you know, Nora Gross went to do some anthropological research about Martha's Vineyard. And you know, Martha's Vineyard had a very high portion of deaf people because there was genetic deafness, came from an English immigrant whose family settled there. And there was a very high portion of people who were deaf. And so she asked around and said, who was deaf to the older people who were still living? And they said, you know, I really don't know because everybody here spoke sign language. So then you realize, like, okay, so deafness could be seen as an impairment, but not in a culture necessarily where everybody speaks sign language. It also turned out to be really useful on the ships in storms and stuff where people could, instead of yelling and they couldn't be heard, they could use sign language. So the whole issue about impairment and is it only medically determined is complicated. Okay, I want to go back to the issue about normal. So I talked about normal, but I think we've also moved into a realm where the normal is supposed to be the center of the bell curve, but we keep pushing that center over to now this becomes like the new normal, and a lot of us spend a lot of time in the gym, spend a lot of time on products and on surgery to try to achieve something like the new normal. So there is a question that even normal itself can switch over to becoming the hypernormal. Just some images of what the normal looks like. And notice that it's always white, it's always fit. We were talking this morning about what people look like in heaven. Either they look like the way they look in advertising, or I wanted to say something I forgot to say this morning, which is when I go to Costco, I look around and I say, this is what heaven looks like. Because really, it's the greatest cross-section of people, at least where I go in Yonkers, New York. I think that's what heaven looks like. Okay, so I did this, the fit and unfit families. Oh, dear, okay. Yeah, so the thing I was saying is with diversity, we use the term celebrate. But weirdly, here's a thing I found that has a completely different meaning. So this is a thing that says it's a group of people who, it's a cartoon, and in one section of the cartoon, everybody's white. In the other section, there are lots of people of different color. And it says, to prevent boredom, life offers many opportunities to interact with a wide variety of people. So why do we choose to only hang around with those who are just like us? Nobody likes to be bored, do they? So the idea is that diversity allows us to live in a more interesting world. And of course, there's no one in the picture with a disability. So that kind of just proves my point a little bit. Okay, so this, okay, how am I going to do this, technical people? This is supposed to be, I click on it? Can you do that? Just wait a second. So this is an ad for, you may remember this is called Campaign for Real Beauty by Dove. And now it's becoming more and more familiar. But I just want you to look at it. So can we run that?
Do your eyes sit wide?
Does your nose go to the side? Does your elbow have a crinkle?
Do your knees sort of wrinkle?
Does your chest tend to freckle?
Do you have a crooked smile?
Do your eyes
Sit wide?
It's an ad that shows a lot of. I'll narrate it for you. Yeah. So it's an ad that shows a lot of different people. It shows a diversity of women of color and national origins, a lesbian couple, a somewhat transsexual-looking woman playing basketball, an older woman, as well as the usual white mother and daughter. All the women are full of life, engaging, but not beautiful by runway standards. And the message being promulgated is that there is no normal when it comes to a woman's appearance. So they're all singing the song to the tune of "Do Your Ears Hang Low?" Don't ask me to do that. But that's what they're saying. So the idea is that this, and there is there's no person, there's no disabled person in it. The advertisement reflects a trend to embrace the diversity of the human body within certain kinds of limits set by television and Hollywood, cherry-picking the aspects of diversity that appealed to a regnant paradigm. But while celebrating diverse bodies, the ads nowhere show us women with disabilities. So what I'm trying to say is that, okay, let me go back. I'm interested in the way that diversity, as it's presented, serves certain functions that are somewhat different from the word normal, but not entirely. And so diversity is well suited to the core beliefs of neoliberalism. If neoliberalism is premised on a culture in which lifestyle and choice predominate, so while normality was enforced to make people conform to some white, Eurocentric, ableist, developed world, heterosexual, et cetera, notion of normality, diversity imagines a world without a ruling gold standard of embodiment. So in our images for diversity, it's very photogenic. And this is the ad, by the way, that's supposed to say, like, it's okay to have curves, to be a little heavier, although by nobody's standards are these women obese. And the other thing is that it's a combination of Dove and Walmart, which is essentially spreading the message paradoxically that if you want to be beautiful, even if you're a little heavier, you still need to buy these products. And they're not cheap. Skincare products are not cheap, as everybody knows. And they come in deceptively small, deceptive packaging. So you think like, oh, that's not bad. I bought a big package, and you open it up, and there's a big jar, and you open that up, and there's a tiny, small amount of goop in there, which you ended up spending way too much money for, under the premise that you will somehow look better. So it's not, the diversity paradigm doesn't work against that. What's not included are excluded groups that may be thought of as abject or hyper-marginalized. It's difficult to imagine a commercial like the one that I've just not shown you that would include homeless people, impoverished people, end-stage cancer patients, the comatose, heroin, crack, or methamphetamine addicts. These groups, battered women, these groups fall into a category of what might be called bare life or Zoe in Giorgio Agamben's terminology. Agamben distinguishes between bios, or life in the polis, or the political state, and Zoe, which he calls bare life, which can be killed without sanction. Zoe is a life defined as not worth living, it's not worthy of life, not worth living. For Agamben, though, the project of modernity and postmodernity is an attempt to reclaim Zoe to bios. Won't go into that too much. But the question is, does diversity do that work? Is it trying to reclaim these groups that we leave out of the diversity paradigm? Is it trying to reclaim them? And I think the answer is no, at least in the general population. So I mean, I want to say that I do think it's a good thing that we're moving toward promoting diversity and away from enforcing normalcy. And there's both a political and social progress in thinking of humans as diverse rather than normal or abnormal. But in accepting this change, we should by no means feel that the new model avoids the pitfall of what Foucault calls technologies of life. It would be difficult to imagine that diversity is so different a concept that it could avoid the larger project of modernity, which is the creation of docile, complacent bodies. One could argue that there is as much social conditioning, care of and for the body, subjection of the body, involved in this version of imagining the diverse human as it was in the previous one of imagining the normal human. And indeed, it would be naive to assume that any contemporary form of social organization does not carry with it elements of control and categorization, no matter how progressive it might seem to us at the time. If there are elements of social control in the idea of diversity, I would argue that we can best see them by looking at how disability fits into or does not fit into the category of diversity. And to do this, I want to point to a dichotomy between the kind of subjectivity implied by diversity, comparing it to the kind of subjectivity given to disability. The point I want to make, or I want to signal here, is that while diversity is the regnant ideology, the older concept of normal still does hold sway, but only when it comes to disability. So, like, we don't talk about ethnic groups or other identities as normal, but we still continue to use the concept of normal with people with disabilities, particularly when they're constructed through medical models. Therefore, the question I want to ask today is whether diversity can ever encompass disability, or whether another way of saying that diversity, because I've been working for something like 20 years at the project of trying to get diversity to include disability. And although have been some advances, it basically hasn't. So I either think like, well, we've either been really effective or there's something about the concept of diversity itself that can't include disability, right? So what is that? I mean, somebody this morning actually, when we were coming up with words about disability, somebody said, not something you choose. And I think that is important because, this is, it's so small, I can't read it, you can't read it. But it was a screen grab I got yesterday. So, and basically it's from a page that was talking about diversity, the importance of diversity. And one of the things it says is that everybody is unique. So but that's a weird paradox because diversity is both about, it's not about everyone being unique. It's about everyone being in a grouping. And that within those groupings, then we can say there should be lots of those groupings. Because identity politics is not about everyone is unique. Identity politics is about, there is this identity, this identity, this identity, and they should all be considered to be identities that we should value. Okay. So I'm gonna. I have a little bit more I want to talk about this, but I don't want to read it. What I want to do is get to this point about the paradox of diversity. So my argument here is that when a baby is born, the first things that the parents want to hear is that the baby is normal. That the doctor comes in, big smile, baby's normal, everyone's happy. People want normality in medical things. We want normal blood pressure. We want normal cholesterol levels. So normal still holds sway in the medical realm, and it gets passed on. And one of the reasons that it's very difficult to fit this into the diversity paradigm is that in the diversity paradigm, in those images that I showed you, people look good. It's like any identity could be a choice. I mean, even though you can't choose to be African American or to be Latino, Latina, or Asian, it's a choice. It's a valid choice. If it were a choice, most people would feel like, yeah, sure, I can do that. But the choice to be disabled doesn't seem like a good choice. It's made to seem like a bad choice. No one, there are very few people who say like, I wish I were disabled. I mean, there's a small group of people called wannabes who, have surgery in some cases to remove their legs because they want to be disabled. But they are a, kind of outlier group. But, so in terms of neoliberalism and the commercial world that we were looking at, it's all based on your ability to choose. You can choose your lifestyle. You can choose your, clothing. It's about choosing to buy things. And the one thing you're not going to choose to buy is a disability. You might choose to buy even a facelift or a new face, or you could choose to have your teeth straightened. But you can't. Most people don't choose to buy to disability. So I'm kind of arguing that the disability paradigm, particularly as it's advertised on TV, advocates a lifestyle of choice, and disability doesn't fit into that. And if it doesn't fit into that, you can say it should be part of the diversity paradigm, but maybe it isn't such a good fit. So disability reveals a state of exception to the diversity paradigm. And disability is seen as a state of abjection or a condition in need of medical cure, and it's resistant. That's the resistant point in the diversity paradigm. In other words, you can't have a statement like, we are all different and we celebrate that diversity, without having some suppressed idea of a norm that defines difference in the first place. You can't have difference without something that would indicate what you're different from, right? It seems impossible to have difference without some standard that sets what's different apart from what is not different. So, in essence, so what I'd like to interrogate is the concept of diversity itself, and I would offer this as an intellectual idea, that diversity as an intellectual idea doesn't have much to offer. The work of the concept is rather simply put, we are all human, diverse as we may be. In that sense, although our diversity is a sign of our difference, it is also a sign of our sameness, the sameness of being human. This is a proposition which few people will disagree with. There's a built-in contradiction in the idea of diversity in neoliberal ideology, which holds first and foremost that each person is a unique individual. Individualism does not meld easily into the idea of group identity. And yet, for neoliberalism, it must. In a diverse world, one must be part of a different group, ethnic, gendered, raced, sexual. It's boring, as that comic said, to be part of a non-diverse world, usually a dominant group. So diversity demands difference so it can claim sameness. We're all different, therefore we're all the same, which is kind of the central paradox. The problem with diversity is it really needs two things to survive as a concept, just as neoliberalism needs this. It needs to imagine a utopia in which difference will disappear while living in a presence that is obsessed with difference. And it needs to suppress everything that confounds this vision. What's suppressed from the imaginary of diversity, a suppression which actually creates neoliberal diversity, are various forms of inequality, notably economic inequality as well as a question of power. And the power and wealth difference is nowhere to be found in this neoliberal view of diversity. But what is also suppressed is disability, particularly a notion of disability without cure. In this sense, disability, and by the way, most disabilities are without cure. In this sense, disability, along with poverty, represents that which must be suppressed for diversity to survive as a concept. You never see conversations in this particular kind of discussion about diversity that really talk about economic diversity, and that becomes a much harder problem to talk about. So ultimately what I'm saying is that disability is an identity that's unlike all the others in that it resists change and cure. It is choosable, and therefore it is not choosable, and therefore it's outside of the dominant ethic of choice. It's an atavism that represents the remainder of normal at the end of normal. And as such, it isn't an anomaly, but rather the capstone that upholds the arch of postmodernity. It's the difference that creates the fantasy of a world in which we are so diverse that we become the same. As such, paradoxically, it upholds meaning and significance because without difference, there can be no meaning. I mean, just even down to like the idea of zeros and ones. There has to be difference for there to be meaning. Or, so thus, disability is the ultimate modifier of identity, holding identity to its original meaning of being one with itself, which is the foundation of difference. So that's the kind of point I wanted to make about the paradox of diversity. But there are a couple, if I have time, how much time do I have? So, and you guys are leaving when? 10 more minutes? I have 10 more minutes, or you? Okay. I'll have a few more minutes, because I just want to talk about a couple of problems in terms of the way we think about disability. That might be interesting for you. And if you want a little bit more about this, the last part of that Beginning with Disability book is called Subject to Debate, and it's about debates within disability studies. So one issue is around pain. The social model doesn't really talk about pain. The social model says the problem in disability is the environment. But then, for a lot of people, disability is uncomfortable. There are things they have to do that are pain. Some people experience chronic pain. There's things about disabilities that are not socially constructive. And so that sort of like is an interrogating question when you think about the social model. The other thing, and I hope this works, let's see, not yet. So someone brought up about the issue about cochlear implants and the deaf culture. So just like super quick, nowadays the cure for deafness is cochlear implants or genetic testing, and like either abortion or pre-implantation genetic testing, so you won't have a child who has deafness because of inherited deafness, or the cochlear implant. And the cochlear implant, a lot of deaf people are against the cochlear implant because they feel that deafness is not a disability, it's a culture, and you would be essentially committing a kind of genocide by getting rid of deaf people and their culture and their beautiful language. And so, the point is that the majority of deaf kids, 95% of deaf kids, are born to hearing parents. So the way that it usually goes is, a child is born, the doctor comes in and says, child's perfect, we're just going to do a hearing test, and they can do them very early now. Come back to the parents and they go like, oh, sorry, your child is deaf. But luckily, we have a cure for deafness now. It's called cochlear implants. They didn't used to implant children until much later, but now they're doing it at 6 months. When you implant, a cochlear implant is a brain implant. So, that's kind of downplayed. They don't like to say that. But it's an implant in the brain. And when you insert it, you have to thread. There's a part of it that has to be thread through the cochlea, which is like the little snail thing in your ear. And in threading this metal thing through that, you remove any residual hearing. So if the child had like 20% residual hearing, it's gone. So they used to only do one side. Because of that, now they do both sides. So they essentially are going to take a child that might have some hearing, we don't know yet, it's very young, and they get rid of all the hearing and put the cochlear implant in. But hey, it cures it, right? Because, so this is, can we play that? So the cochlear implant basically is like a good hearing aid. It's like a better hearing aid, but it doesn't cure deafness. That is a complete myth. What it sounds like when you're listening to various things through cochlear implants, because I think most people don't know. You asked me the question, and yeah. So it's not hearing. For most people who wear cochlear implants, if you cover the mouth, they won't be able to know what you're saying. So it's a good hearing aid. Sometimes it's better, but it's not a solution. And then the problem is that, like if you're, take yourself back to being a newborn baby, everything's coming at you, all the sensory information. But let's say you can't hear. So everything's coming through your eyes. The world is alive. You don't know you're deaf, but you know that all this information is coming through your eyes. Suddenly, they put this thing on, and let's say it's not very good quality information that's coming in. You still have your eyes, which are brilliant. So you want to explore the world with your eyes. One of the ways that deaf people communicate is with sign language. But people, these 95% of the parents of deaf children are told you're not allowed to let the child learn sign language. Because if they learn sign language, they're going to favor the visual. And they're not going to go to the poor quality information that's coming in through their ears or through the implant. So they are not allowed to learn sign language. Then they grow up and they have not great hearing. And by the way, you're stuck with what you were in, like when it's like whatever car you first bought, that would be the car you would have now. You can't upgrade what's been put in you. They can't take it out and put new stuff in. They can improve the quality of the external processor, but they can't do that. So basically, you're stuck with it. You grow up. You're in a world with hearing kids. You're not really part of them. You're shunned because you maybe talk funny. Maybe you're not getting what they're saying. People are talking quickly. They have their backs turned. Maybe it's in the swimming pool where you have to remove the external device. You can't hear anything. So you're not fully part of it. Then you decide you want to be part of the deaf world. Yeah, but you're 18 years old. You've never learned sign language. You might go to college. You might go to someplace, but you're never going to speak sign language like a native. And therefore, you'll be shunned or not entirely included in the deaf world. Although you can. Some people are. Some people are better at learning sign language. Some people are pretty good on cochlear implants. Some people are almost, and those are the ones who get trotted out in the publicity photos. And by the way, I'm sure you've all seen the thing with the cochlear implant where it's put in and then they turn it on with the baby and the baby goes like that, yeah, there's something, but it's not going to be enough for speech and hearing for most deaf kids, you know. And so the point is that, well, if that comes back on, I'll show you what it sounds like. It depends on the number of channels. It depends how good the cochlear implant is. By the way, cochlear implants, a double cochlear implant costs what a really, really good Mercedes with everything loaded on it would cost, or the down payment on a multi-million-dollar house. So there's only 3 or 4 companies in the world that make cochlear implants. Everybody makes money along the way. The company that sells them, the audiologists, everybody. All right, you want to give it a try?
The BBC would like to announce that the next scene is not considered suitable for family viewing. It contains scenes of violence involving people's heads and arms getting chopped off, their ears nailed to trees, and their toenails pulled out in slow motion. There are also scenes of naked women with floppy breasts.
So the point about cochlear implants is there's a debate, let's put it that way, and deaf people are losing the debate because of the 95% parents, and that now we're getting to be a redefinition of deafness because most younger kids now have cochlear implants, but they're also deaf. You know, I mean, let's say you take your external processor off at least half the day. So you're deaf half the day. It's not like it cures it. All right. Yeah. So then there's the issue about prenatal testing and prenatal screening. Genetic testing and prenatal screening. You've all probably seen Gattaca, the movie. And this is a question that is alive in terms of genetics and eugenics that are operating now, not in the concentration camps and not in sterilization, but in the question of who should live and who should not. What child should live, or I don't want to put it that way. What zygote should be chosen? What disease is okay to be born with, and what disease is not? It's carried out by ordinary people, not by bad scientists. People make those decisions all the time. We give genetic counseling, but we don't give counseling by people with those genetic diseases, let's say. If a child, if a person finds out that they have a child that has an embryo that has a certain genetic disorder, there should be someone who has that genetic disorder come in and counsel the person as well, so that people with cystic fibrosis can come in and say, like, hey, I have cystic fibrosis, and deaf people can come in and say, like, I'm deaf, I'll tell you about the deaf community, rather than just have people have a genetic counselor say, like, well, wouldn't you rather have a normal child? There's an issue of assisted suicide. This is a big issue within the disability community. Opposition to a lot of movies that tend to show disabled people killing themselves, from $1 Million Baby to The Sea Inside, Barbarian Invasions, where the solution to the movie is always that the disabled person kills themselves. And then there's Brittany Maynard, who you may remember, who had a serious brain disease, who opted for assisted suicide. It's a complicated issue. It isn't a slam dunk one way or the other, but it's something I just raise as things that people are debating. And then the issue about should disabled actors play disabled roles. These are all pictures of people who are not disabled, playing disabled characters in Glee, in Rain Man, in Born on the 4th of July, and My Left Foot. A lot of people within the disability community call it cripping up, or the way that blackface was done, and it was an accepted format. We don't allow it anymore. But so that, instead of having blackface, people are pretending to be disabled, when there are a lot of perfectly good disabled actors who are not getting those roles. But then on the other hand, the other side of the argument is to say, hey, isn't that what acting is about? Shouldn't actors, that's what acting is. You play a role that you're not, So that debate goes on. Here are some examples of disabled actors actually playing disabled roles. And Then another question, which obviously would be interesting to talk about, but we don't have time, is facilitated sex for people with disabilities. People with disabilities tend not to be chosen as sexual partners, particularly by quote-unquote normal people. There are some people whose disabilities are so major that they can't have sex alone, and they're not likely to have sex with somebody else. So there are sexual surrogates who can do this. If you ever see the movie The Sessions, it's all about that, although non-disabled actor playing disabled role. But it's a good movie that raises these issues. On the other hand, is the problem of prostitution and female exploitation. So is it good to have someone having facilitated sex by a practitioner, or is that just another form of prostitution? You have to decide. Okay. There's also the, I'm sorry, going on too long. There's also another, the other thing is the intersectionality. This is from your website. No, you know, I couldn't find many images of people with disabilities on Western Theological's website. But, you know, in terms of intersectionality, people talk about race and gender. They don't often talk about disability. Is that really intersectionality? This was the 2 images that I found on your website of people with disabilities. There's a woman in a hospital bed, and there was this flow chart which didn't seem to include, in Title IX, basically it was Title IX, but it didn't include anything about disability, like if you had a problem with disability. And, but you do have this friend program, which seemed to be really cool. And the ultimate point about disability, if I could reduce it to a phrase, would be the phrase, nothing about us without us, is that we're talking about compassion today. Compassion is good. But in order to have a disability be really involved and active in your life and the university life, it has to be by people with disabilities. You know, they have to, it's always been a situation where there are organizations to help people with disabilities. But the reality of the political life is that this stuff has to be by people with disabilities. Nothing about us without us. Okay, thank you.
Time for a couple of questions if you'd like to move on to take some questions. It's the first time surrogate sex has ever been said in this building.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Any questions?
Okay, you can't leave until one person asks a question.
What would be the benefits, if any, and the dangers of thinking about the entire human race as having some sort of disability?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. One way to do that is people often say, like, I would get up in front of a group of people and say, like, I don't have a disability, but I hope to have one, because the alternative would be, you know, death, right? You know, eventually everybody's going to get a disability. So there is that argument. I think it tends to minimize disability to a certain extent, because if everybody has it, then what is it? You know, as it would in almost any category. You know, so there's a positive side to saying that, because we're all vulnerable, and it's possible that any of us could be disabled in an hour from now. But it also stretches the category so much that, you know, it becomes a little, if everybody's disabled, what does that mean? Oh, yeah.
Is there anything that you would want to redeem about, I mean, I know the pernicious origins of normal, but before that, clearly there was some understandings, you know, that maybe not as white supremacist, you know, but some idea of human nature. You know, eyes are meant to see, minds are meant to know, feet are meant to walk. You know, this is just part of being human. And we act like that. I mean, I wear corrective lenses because I think losing my sight is problematic. You know, so we have corrective lenses. We educate students because we want to move ignorance to wisdom, right? So we have, you know, even my son is autistic, right? We're trying to help him to integrate and to speak and to interact with, right? So we have some sense of, I mean, we act on the sense of normal, right? Or pick another word, human nature, or, you know, a good life, or
Yeah.
something like that. I mean, is there anything you'd want to redeem about normal?
Well, what I would, let me put it this way. The interesting part of the project about normal was discovering that it's a word that entered the English language very recently. So then the other fun part is like to think, well, what would the world be like before then? And I think you're trying to imagine that. And what words would you use? I mean, they definitely had a notion of the mean. Aristotle talks about the mean. They had an idea of type. They had an idea of race, meaning, you're a group of people. It didn't have that later meaning of that it came to have. So, but none of those have a kind of urgency to them the way that normal does. And you can imagine, and then also there's the ideal. So if you have a notion of the ideal, there's something about never always falling below that. There isn't this like pressure. You can, like if your ideal is Jesus, you're never going to be Jesus. So you can have this kind of comfort, like I'm going to get a little bit better, but I'm not going to reach that. But normal is totally like you're forced to embrace that. You have to, in some sense, be normal. So that's where I would go. I mean, I'm not against some ideas of average, but without the moral value that's placed on it and the urgency, the enforced conformity that normal produces. Yeah.
So I'm a mom with acute flash syndrome, and I'm a mom who's talking into a dead mic. So there we go. I'm a mom of a kid with Usher syndrome, and we are raising him bilingual. That means he's learning both English and ASL. And so going back to your idea of differences and celebrating diversity and identity and how that plays into disability, how does that work when you have a kid who's using technology, but also I have a desire, a hope that one day he will embrace deaf culture. That's his choice, but you were saying things about, your disability, you don't have a choice, or you wouldn't make that choice. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because we are in a world now where people are making that choice a little bit, especially in the deaf world. Am I going to identify myself as hearing, or am I going to be deaf, or am I going to be somewhere in between?
Right.
Do I use technology? Do I not, etc.?
Right. No, it's a good question. And what I would say is, first of all, he didn't have a choice about whether he was going to have Usher's syndrome or not. So that's what I mean about he didn't choose that. But you're raising him in a way, which I can applaud, where you're giving him options and you're saying someday you'll choose, which is really important. I mean, because those 95% of parents with deaf kids are saying, we're not, most of them are saying, we're not giving you that choice. We're going to give you cochlear implants and you're going to make it in a hearing world, and an oral hearing world, which is, for some kids that will work. There are some kids who have good language abilities, but most deaf kids don't thrive, even with cochlear implants. So I think the choice element that you're giving is a little different. It's like, given the fact that you have this, then here we're going to give you choices, which is great.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing what you did today. I really appreciate it. I just have a comment. I work at a disability organization in Grand Rapids, and I've grown up my whole life as someone who's legally blind, and I have cerebral palsy. But I've really, in learning about the different kind of models of how we think about disability, have struggled with not fully buying into the social model. And you gave language to exactly what my struggle was like, the pain is real, the medical diagnosis is real, and how can I fully embrace one model or the other? And so that was just really a comforting piece of language that was given to something that I've really struggled with professionally and personally for like the last 5 years maybe. So thank you.
Well, thank you for giving us that insight. One thing I would say is that the social model and why people are debating it is because it puts pressure on people with disabilities to like celebrate diversity, celebrate disability. And some, for a lot of disabilities, that's possible, but there are other disabilities that kind of suck, and that are difficult and hard to live with and painful, and Even though you might be completely like, I'm disabled and proud, and I've learned a lot from my disability, and I wouldn't trade it, which is what a lot of the people with disabilities say. Almost, that's the other thing, is like most people who don't have disabilities think it's not choosable. It's not a choice. But if you talk to people with disabilities, I have almost never met a person with a disability who says, I mean, it's possible, certainly possible, but who really grew up with a disability, who says, like, I would trade it. I would want to not be disabled. So there's this huge gap between what people without disabilities think of people with disabilities and vice versa. On the other hand, there's a problem of living with certain disabilities that weren't being fully addressed in the initial wave of disability studies, and people are now talking about that.
Thank you. And thank you again.